And I think that's where I want to start off my comments on climate mobility. We do not want to move. Um, a couple of days ago, when a typhoon was threatening the Philippines, we heard that 1 million people were evacuated. We don't have those options in small islands. There's nowhere for us to evacuate to. There's no feasibility to evacuate the population. You cannot get into your car and drive anywhere. And the other thing is when we have to move, we lose more than just the physical move. We're not moving just because the structure is going to be destroyed. Very often people say, well, you live in a vulnerable place. Why don't you just move? You know, the hurricane is coming. But over and over, we can see populations and communities, even as recent as in Jamaica, we do not want to move because the presence of belonging means more than a physical structure to us. After Hurricane Irma in 2017, the entire infrastructure in Barbuda was destroyed. It was 90% of all homes destroyed. And 1 week after, a matter of days after, there was another Category 5 threatening. And we had no choice but to evacuate the people to Antigua. Those people who were evacuated, although their homes have been rebuilt, they're still suffering the psychosocial impacts of that evacuation, that move, that loss, that inability to see how their possessions were changed because they left an impact that they didn't quite realize. They left for a month and then they came back and somebody had gone in and cleaned it up because it was unsafe. But that missing element, that missing transition has continued to impact them. So when we speak about mobility and loss and damage and the linkages, we have to understand that in thinking about addressing the issue of mobility, there's several aspects that we have to look at. There is the physical resilience, that is, building homes better will require an incremental increase in the cost to an individual to be able to live in the place that they call their home. In Antigua and Barbuda, we have a saying, my navel string is buried here. What that means is when we're born in a community, your umbilical cord is literally buried where you live. And so that sense of belonging is a trigger for us psychologically. And when we have to move, it's not just a physical move, because many people have chosen to move for economic reasons, but they still come back home. In all Caribbean islands, we may move temporarily and come back. But that decision would have been a decision that people made themselves, and they're not moving their whole family. Parts of the family move and they come back. So maybe the working people move, the grandchildren are raised by the grandparents. This is Caribbean tradition and Caribbean culture. And so it's not that we want to move permanently. We need to be resilient to be able to live in our communities. The other issue that I want to talk about is the actual loss of culture. Because even if we build more resilient and we strengthen our homes and we move away physically within the community from the most vulnerable areas, when riverbeds widen, when the coastline is eroded, we have grave sites being destroyed, we have cultural artifacts being lost to the sea, and those are unrecoverable. And so when we are talking about mobility, we need to understand that it's not just the human mobility, it's the loss of culture and practice and traditional ways of living and accesses to coastlines. Because now, if we have to reinforce our coastline with boulders, we're no longer able to pull up our fishing boats on the coast for our traditional protection measures. We're no longer be able to take the elderly into the sea because the sea is seen as medicine. But if you have to put a physical rock barrier to protect your coast from erosion, we have no access to the sea in our traditional measures. So I wanted to make the point throughout this discussion that when we look at mobility, yes, we want to be able to be safe during impacts, but the greater measure is that we want to be able to preserve our physical infrastructure by being more resilient. We want to be able to preserve our culture, our traditional practices, and we want to be able to exist in the fabric of the network of community that we have a norm to. The other issue that I wanted to bring up is the ability to move. If you don't have economic resources, if you don't have finances, you cannot move. Again, I'm going to draw you back to the case in Jamaica. If people don't have a car, money, cash, and somewhere to go to, you cannot move. And if people feel unsafe in moving anywhere or feel that their assets will not be protected, they will not move. And so, in the fabric of looking at what we need to address financially, these are all the parts of the puzzle that you have to look at. So, in closing, I wanted to make the point, as I was on an interview this morning in Antigua, and the interviewer asked me, well, how many villages will we lose? And I said to her, hopefully none, because a village is more than a physical place. It is tradition, it is culture, it is a way of life and a way of being. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Thomas Camacho Thomas. That was wonderful. And I love the closing statement around the village being more than a physical place. I remember from my youth the statement like home is not a place, home is the people that you feel attached to. But of course, as the ambassador also underlined, the physical home is also quite important, and protecting, the ability to protect your physical home is an important starting point. I would like to invite our first presenter, Ms. Ritu Bharadwaj from the IIED, who will share with us the findings of a large-scale project they have done across multiple countries, looking at loss and damage experiences in the context of climate mobility. So Ritu, over to you.
Thank you, sir, and it's really great to be here. Just to give you a small background as to where we come from in terms of loss and damage, we have an initiative called All Act, Alliance for Locally Led Transformative Action on Loss and Damage. So we say transformative action on loss and damage is something which has been co-designed by a lot of global south organizations and governments. So we sat together, we went through a series of deliberative dialogue. And why we say deliberative dialogue? Because we did not go into those discussions having predefined solutions. So we let the design of this initiative come from the governments and the local grassroots organization. So I'm very happy, like Ambassador Relator just went, but Antigua Barbuda is one of the big members. We have all 39 states which are part of All Act. Apart from that, overall, we have about 50 governments. We have about 60 grassroots organizations, and OCOP is one of them. And I'm really happy that some of the evidence that I'm going to be presenting, if you can have the slides on. Okay, wow. So very tech savvy, this is the only pavilion where I've seen everything works very well. So, what I'll be talking about is some of the evidence that we've generated in partnership with our grassroots organization. And I was really happy that Shakirul could join as well. What we are going to say is, Ambassador Ruleta made a very important point that, and Sarah also made that point about right to stay, but right to move. And how do we ensure that? So, and I'm going to start with this slide which shows that climate disaster intensities are increasing across the globe, but it's more pronounced in areas which are less capable of protecting themselves. So we all know that climate impacts are everywhere, but it becomes a disaster only when people are not able to cope and the number of people impacted becomes higher. So the same level of impact maybe in Europe will not become a disaster because they have the wherewithal to protect themselves. So when this increasing disaster intensity hit people, what kind of families really move and what don't? Because in the same community, you will see that not everyone is moving. Some are staying and some are moving. So who are they? And why this becomes important, because I've also become recently a lead author for IPCC for loss and damage. And one thing that keeps getting discussed is what's the causality? How much of that 100 migrants is actual climate migrants? That's not right, because everyone is a climate migrant because they've been impacted by climate to some extent. Climate has acted as a tipping point to all the predisposing factors that they were experiencing. So we need to quantify that tipping point and say that it is a contributor to a whole lot of other factors, and that is why we use something called 3P approach. So predisposing factor includes a lot of factors such as conflict, economic, demographic, social, political, and you'll typically see it's women and girls who typically get impacted more. And they could be women and girls staying, not able to move, trapped population, and those who are moving as well, who become victims of trafficking and modern slavery and so on. So we need to understand to what extent predisposing is combining with precipitating factor, and when there's a lack of protection, and when this is an important factor where the solutions come. Because today the purpose of my presentation is not just to highlight issues but also solutions, because we have talked about issues a lot. So it's about how do we create that protective factor so that they don't reach that tipping point. Even if they want to move, that's fine, but they move with protection. So I'm going to share examples of 3 countries. So one in Mali, of course, which we recently did. And why I picked up Mali? Because Mali has 2 precipitating factors, conflict and climate. So the way we do it is to look at inherent resilience index. And these are some of the indicators we looked at. I'll flip through these slides very quickly. I just wanted to show to what extent non-migrant, migrant, and displaced. And we have used this terminology, migrant and displaced. Migrants are those who come back, who still have some roots. Displaced, who lose their place forever. And they can't come back. So you can see the level to which these are some of the predisposing factors: the education status, the food consumption score, the households headed by women. They have less agency. Then percentage of household owning agricultural land. You see typically displaced families don't have agricultural land. Then average household income. You can see that. Then again, so what we do based on all of these information, we create something called predisposing inherent resilience index. Then we also look at the precipitating factor, because the causality is important. So if you look at the precipitating factor, you can see how the climate impacts have increased. And then using that, we work out how is the average frequency of drought increasing over the last 3 decades, and floods increasing, and to what extent that's impacting migration. So you can see last 3 decades how it has increased. And then where are they migrating to? Is it within the circle, cross border? And this is the protection factor. I deliberately kept this red line to show this is where it should be, and this is where they are. So there's a lack of protection for everyone. It's Mali. It's a conflict-affected state, which means that the governance system is so weak that even the regular social protection is not available to them. And we also ran a regression model to show to what extent people experiencing climate impacts are vulnerable to getting displaced or moving. And this is the overall assessment. So we had some discussion about quantifying both economic and non-economic loss and damage. And why we do this, why we quantify the non-economic side of loss and damage, is because it's people who have land, houses, something to lose physically are the ones who always get compensated. But people who are landless, who have no other means of income, they never get compensated, but they are losing themselves. They are suffering mental health, anxiety. Some of them are undertaking hysterectomy. This is another study we did. So we need to quantify both economic and non-economic loss and damage, and you can see the level to which it is happening in the case of displaced. Somebody asked me, why 184%? How can they lose more than what they earn? Yes, they are losing because they're selling their land, they're selling their livestock, they are selling everything they have, which means it ultimately boils down to 184%. Very quickly, in case of Bangladesh, which we did with Okup, Shakirul is here. I'm not showing all the data, but this is the level to which the migration has increased in the last 3 decades. The international migration has increased, and the level to which they're exposed to modern slavery in absence of protection factor. You will see internal migrants are exposed to 55%, whereas international migrants who have no support system, 99% are exposed to modern slavery. Again, in India, this is how migration has increased in the last 3 years, 3 decades. And this is the extent to which the loss and damage is suffered by migrant and non-migrant. So that's non-migrant, and this is migrant. So they're suffering more than 50% of what their actual income is. Sorry. So what would solution look like? We talk about social protection program because we see social protection program, it's, see, almost 45% of vulnerable population are already covered with it. And about 500 billion is something what governments are already spending. So we have a base system on which we can build on. So that's why we all, and social protection program have been proven to be useful to protect, like, help communities who are in poverty, address inequality, but also we have seen in several cases where if a social protection is available, then they're able to tide over the crisis, at least maintain their consumption level. But that's not sufficient. We need to equip this social protection program to support migrants before, during, and after. Why before? So that they don't migrate in distress. If they can migrate as a choice, not as a distress. Two, if there are certain places which are reaching the limits of adaptation. So to equip those communities with adequate skills, providing them proper livelihood opportunity in the sites where they are migrating, and this should happen before migration, so they don't move without aimlessly. They move towards opportunity, not distress. Two, en route is the time when most of them becomes victim of trafficking, because they just don't know on the way where are they going, somebody is taking away their passport or their identity. So this is where they need protection. And three, when they're moving to whichever place, they become victim of modern slavery. How can we combine social protection with informal labor market reform so they do not become victims of modern slavery? So how are we trying to do this? We are trying to achieve this through two frameworks using the social protection program. And these are both two early intervention. One early intervention is direct benefit transfer, like food aid, cash transfers, and so on, provided just before a disaster strike. What Ruleta was mentioning, if they have cash, they can move, they can go to safety, which is what communities don't have. And two, we can't keep them exposed to that, being vulnerable to disaster every time it strikes. So we have to build in resilience, and that investment should come now so that they can move beyond the vulnerability threshold. So they're not exposed. So we need both, but we need the second one even more so that at least they have resilience. They don't want that aid all the time. So how do we equip our existing social protection programs so they can incorporate those elements is something we are doing. We have already done this with 8 governments. We are now expanding it to 2 more governments. We have Emiliano sitting here who's doing this in Brazil, because Brazil has a big social protection program. So we want to see whether, if it can work in Brazil, maybe they can offer more learnings. We are doing it in Bangladesh. We are doing it in Senegal right now. So what do? We use a very diagnostic method, very objective, quantitative method to understand where exactly there are gaps in policies. We have 37 indicators here and 33 indicators here, where exactly there are gaps in policies and systems and where there are gaps in delivery mechanism. We have done these for 8 countries. These reports are already out. But what's the purpose of this? The purpose of this assessment is to work out where the gaps exist, where the opportunities are, and then how can those gaps be filled. And I'll just give you a snapshot of what that looks like. This is a snapshot. So we worked out there's some intervention which need cost in investment, and there's some intervention that needs policy and systems change, technical assistance. So for example, how many countries have early warning system? How many countries have digitized social protection registry on which climate risks have been layered? And that's where we'll be interested in looking at your presentation. So these are, do we have portability in social protection program? That's something we need for the migrants' households. Then, these are, so I'm not going to, we have limited time, but we're happy to discuss this later with you. And then intervention that require policy and regulatory changes. So because we are working with government, this is something that we want to do with them. And this does not require any money. And this is what the governments are willing to change, provided that finances arrive. So what does the overall cost? We have much more breakdown of this. So in these 8 countries, with an investment of 237 million, you can influence $66 billion of investment that's already going in social protection. So that 66 billion can help you deliver climate resilience as well, both for migrants as well as non-migrants people. And with those 2 framework that I presented through social protection program, early resilience investment and anticipatory direct benefit transfer, if the communities are hit by climatic, so we used last 62 years disaster data to project what loss and damage would look like, and we also use grassroots, like from Mali, the data that to understand to what extent, if the existing social protection programs were used, the households suffer 98% of loss of their income, late humanitarian response 59. But if you do early resilience investment, there'll be still losses, but it'll only be limited to 27%. This will be the benefit. But for every $1 invested with existing social protection program, if you invest that, you get a benefit of 5.17. Now, this is my final assessment slide. In those 8 countries, the future loss and damage is projected to be to the tune of 21 billion. But if you invest 4.1 billion, then you can avoid that 21 billion losses. If direct anticipatory benefit transfers are done, then the same loss can be avoided with 10 billion. So the whole point is this economics. So why are we not investing? This is the economics we presented before Fund for Responding to Loss and Damage, and we said that we need to support countries. For Senegal, for example, only 14 million is required to take their existing social protection program to deliver climate resilience. And this is something that we breaking down for individual countries. But none of this can happen without local level intervention. Well, yeah, 1 minute. So this is a local level intervention that we do through CSIC toolkit. So it's a comprehensive climate impact quantification toolkit, which is about assessing both economic and non-economic losses, damages, where we are equipping local grassroots organizations to do this themselves, to work out what changes they want in the existing social protection program. So this is an assessment which, like community assessment, which is done by in Senegal with our local partner, ENDA. So we have trained them and they do it themselves. They are the ones developing that roadmap with the government. These are just some pictures. So, this is again from India, where they're using the same assessment to translate their, so here, we create these mentors who work with grassroots organizations. And then the whole idea, so you can see they're using AI-based climate planning now to deliver climate resilience through existing social protection program. And this is something we are doing. We are developing roadmap with existing governments to seek funding from GCF, from FRLD, and other innovative sources of financing. So with that, I'll end. And thank you all for listening. If you have an interest, I'll be around just after this session.
Thanks, Ritu. And I think there was a lot in there. So I hope we'll have some time to unpack some of this because you went through so much information. I definitely recall that one of the recommendations from our Uganda Climate Mobility Deep Dive was to say, the existing social protection programs should be climate-proofed, so to say. But I don't want to take more time. I'm passing the floor to Mr. Michal Borzinski from the Luxembourg Institute of Socioeconomic Research.
Thank you so much for having me here, and thank you for the opportunity to present our project. Our mission is actually to provide information, data for policymakers, stakeholders, and in general, people who are interested in the way that climate change will affect not only the economy, but also migration movements. So what we do is we provide an open access online dashboard that visualizes the data that we provide from our modeling on the impact of climate change on global economy, inequality, poverty, individual well-being, and migration. So long-term, voluntary, permanent, climate-induced migration of people. So of course, behind the dashboard, what we have is a model. So let me take just few moments to tell you a bit about the model so you know how the projections are constructed, and then we can talk about how we map climate hazards into damages, all right? As the main topic of the session. So the model that we provide here is a special general equilibrium model of the world economy. And what is specific about the model is the geographical resolution. So it's defined at very fine 5 by 5 kilometer raster grid pixels, millions of them, which are local economies characterized by demographics, economics, and climatic factors, all right? And the model is composed of several modules. These are different markets that are interrelated. So we have production, we have consumption of goods and services, we have labor markets, international trade, and of course we have migration decisions of individuals. Now, why this is important to say? Because then when we will try to map climate hazards into damages, we need to do some trade-offs here because we have a large-scale model, global model that requires a lot of feeding of the data. So you will see we have to do some trade-offs in terms of how detailed we can be about climate hazards or climate damages and what is feasible to model, what data we have, what we can fit into the model. All right, so the hazards that we are including are in general 5 of them. And let me talk in particular about each of them, how we map those hazards into damages. The easiest thing we can do is the sea level rise, the first one. So sea level rise, here we have fantastic data on how the level of sea will change in different climate scenarios in the future. So this is the paper by Kireschi et al. Then we also have fantastic elevation maps by pixels. So we put those 2 layers together and we have, with the help of an infiltrating algorithm, we have an extent to which coastal pixels are going to be affected by permanent flooding. And this in our model causes 2 important things. First of all, permanent loss of production capacity as if capital was totally lost. And secondly, people are forcibly displaced from the places where their homes are permanently flooded. The second thing, which is not a common thing that people are discussing in terms of climate damages, it's the impact of temperature on workers' productivity. And the fact that when it's hot, well, you cannot work in the field, you cannot work outside. So what we do here is we use the damage functions estimated by, or not estimated, they are actually literally data collected in the field in different countries, measuring how people's productivity changes with the temperature. This is the horizontal axis, and the vertical axis is the loss in productivity. This is across 3 sectors which you are using: agriculture, industry, and services. So the points you see there are the actual data points that they measure in Kjellström et al. And what we are doing is just fitting the curve so that we have something continuous. So that's the first step. And the second step is, well, we need to have temperature data, but a particular type of temperature data. We need temperature distributions at the pixel level, which we compute ourselves using the CMI P6 data. And then we put the 2 together. So we have the frequencies of temperatures, we have the damage functions, so we can easily get the actual loss in workers' productivity due to temperature. Another thing is land damage, so the change in land productivity due to climate change. Here we are super lucky because our colleagues from IASA and FAO already did the job. With the GAES data set, which shows you how crop yields are gonna evolve over time in different climatic scenarios, we have exactly what we need. So what we are doing with this data, the GAES data, by the way, you can check the data yourself. This is really a fantastic data set. We are simply aggregating it at the crop level. So we are aggregating all the crops, 15 top crops that are cultivated in the world. We have the shares, we have the spatial extent where the crops are grown, and we simply compute an index that allows us to have this agriculture damage. And the final thing, probably the most complex one, the disasters. So in our model, we have 4 types of disasters. We have droughts, floods, heat waves, and cyclone damage. So just to trying to be synthetic about how we are approaching this, we need 2 things here. First of all, we need the projections for the future and different climate scenarios of how the intensity and frequency of those disasters will look like. This is climate data, and this is relatively easy because climate data is good quality, very well downscaled, and available online. But the second thing we need is the damage function, this translation of those climate hazards into climate damage. And for this, we are using the MDAT database. This is a database that is actually mapping all the disasters that happened in the last decades. and gives you the data on how many people were affected, how many died, and what is the USD value of losses generated by each and every hazard, each and every disaster that is included there. So using this data and the past intensity and frequency of disasters, we are able to estimate those damage functions that translate the hazards into climate damages. All right, so why we are doing this? All of this is then feeding into our macroeconomic model of the world economy so that we can have pathways of macroeconomic dynamics so that you, stakeholders, policymakers, people who are interested in general, you can access the data through our dashboard. And just to show you how the dashboard looks like, I will not showcase you the dashboard, but please have a look. This is our dashboard that actually visualizes the data and allows you to search through macroeconomic impacts. Sorry, let me just. Okay, so you don't see the. No problem. So let me just go through this. So you can visualize the data using our web page, our dashboard, and that allows you to go through the data on population, on migration, on different macroeconomic variables across different scenarios. You can search through geographies. The map is interactive and allows you to just play around with the data that we generate. You can search through different socio-demographic groups, so different migration matrices for young individuals versus old individuals, male versus female, different levels of education. All of this is included within the dashboard. So please, if you have a desktop or a laptop and a good access to the Wi-Fi here, go to clickme.lizer.lu, check our product, because this is the product for you, for those people who need information about the impact of climate change on the economy and on climate migration. But please don't do it through the mobile devices because of the data requirements. Mobile devices will not be able to go through the dashboard. And just to visualize very, very fast, I still have a minute. This is the dashboard, and just to show you how you can navigate through the geographies, zooming in, looking at the pixels. This is actually net migration, net climate migration by pixel in a RCP 7.0 2050 scenario. And just look at the situation in the area that you are interested in. Then you can compare, here without migration, you can compare different scenarios. So RCP 4.5 versus RCP 7.0 versus RCP 8.5. You can look at the dynamics. And of course, I didn't mention the sociodemographic dimension here on the right-hand side. You can select all of this by age, gender, education. And I think I can stop here. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Michael. So we've had Rito demonstrating the extreme increase of loss and damage that stems from displacement in the case studies that you did, and also the significant financial and, of course, human costs that could be reduced with preventative action and using existing social protection systems to be more preventative, to build resilience before more hazards occur. We had Michael laying out how these kind of anticipatory tools could help governments look at potential future losses and damages associated with climate impacts, especially economic losses and damages linked to labor productivity, for example, and how that might in turn drive migration. I would like to now invite our panelists to take their seats on stage. Is this us? I think this is not us. Hello? Did I just get out? No, we're still here. Okay, sorry. And I will introduce you in turn. And maybe also just take this off and join you. This is better to hold, yeah. I'm very pleased to be joined by three colleagues who have, I think, quite distinct perspectives on this topic. and maybe reactions to the presentation. So feel free also to reflect or comment on what you just saw. But I would like to maybe kick us off with Salote Soko, who joins us from the United Unitarian Committee. And Salote, maybe you can share with us a little bit your perspective as a Pacific Islander on this topic. The Pacific has been at the forefront of making the case for loss and damage to be recognized as a track in the negotiations at COP, but also to have material outcomes, not just talks here. So yeah, please share with us your perspective and how you're coming to this issue.
Thank you, Sarah. Bulabinaka, everyone. I'm so thrilled to be here. The Unitarian Universalist Service Committee has been working with frontline communities in the Pacific to address the issue of displacement. We work with communities that have been experiencing displacement for the past, I would say, 5 to 6 decades. So this is not a new issue for the Pacific. It's been occurring over the decades. It's been building up, and today there are communities that have already forcibly moved from their homes, and relocation has already started happening. And so this is not new for the Pacific. It's been happening even predating the formal discussions here at the COP. And so we see and look at displacement and loss and damage as a climate justice issue. These communities have contributed nothing to the problem, and so their displacement and forced relocation from their homes is a human rights violation. It is an injustice, and many of these communities have also experienced displacement and forced relocation historically because of colonialism and extraction that have been perpetrated by states. And so it's through that lens where UUSC works. And we provide flexible, participatory funding to help communities exercise their right to self-determination in addressing both the issue of forced displacement and loss and damage. And I'm happy to share more about my approach now. Do you want me to do that or later? Okay. Okay, thank you.
So the maybe we'll go next to a colleague from Ghana, Dr. Derry, who's joining us from the climate policy side in Ghana. Maybe you can share with us first your perspective on the loss and damage conversation here at COP, if you wish, and also specifically in Ghana, what is happening to address loss and damage that you're seeing from climate impacts?
Okay, so thank you very much. Yes, so loss and damage definitely has come to stay with us insofar as the climate crisis have not yet been resolved. Until we resolve the climate crisis, definitely we continue to face issues relating to extreme weather events related to climate, and as a result of that, people's property, livelihoods, and sometimes some non-economic losses happening as a result of these extreme weather events. Basically, at the COP here, the conversation around loss and damage, yes, as a country, we are deeply involved in that because we are experiencing it every now and then. Last year, there was a dam spill in Ghana as a result of heavy rains and floods. So we needed to spill our hydro dam, or else the dam was going to break down. And this led to about 35,000 people being displaced. I can't even count the non-economic losses associated with this. Statistics have shown that we lose about $200 million annually due to disasters related to extreme weather events. So we are very much involved in the discussions here. We want to see the loss and damage fund operational. That is what we are yearning for. I mean, we are tired with the discussions around the subject. We want to see capitalization. We want to see people put in money and that money being dispersed to those who need it most. So that is what we want to see here. But then in Ghana, there are quite a number of things that we are doing. And I was looking at the presentation that was done by one of our colleagues earlier on in terms of the social protection interventions that we are making, and also the climate insurance that Ghana is currently pursuing with the Global Shield and also the CVF assisting. All this is just to make sure that we are able to provide the needed insurance for communities, for farmers, for people's livelihoods, so that when there are extreme events, they are able to bounce back, to normal life. So that will be my introductory remarks at this stage.
Thank you very much. And you both already talked a little bit about the kind of mechanisms to address loss and damage and the financial tools, perhaps. But maybe, Kira, your perspective as somebody who has spent a lot of time looking at climate mobility and kind of the both drivers and impacts of that. How do you see this issue sitting in relation to the conversation on loss and damage? So how does climate mobility fit in the loss and damage conversation? And also, how do you see the developments that have maybe taken place in terms of trying to really institutionalize this issue more, and how it could be useful to address the climate mobility issue?
Yeah, thank you so much. And it's a great pleasure to be here. I think the key word is agency. It's a question of agency, whether people are able to decide whether to move or not, right? And also to then shape their lives thereafter. So what we are seeing in many contexts, and I've been fortunate to visit many of the places that we have heard stories about today. So I've been to Fiji, talked to a village leader there whose village was going to be moved, relocated. Been to Bangladesh and also parts of Micronesia, Sahel, also Antigua and Barbuda. And what I see over and over again as a researcher is the situation that choices are being taken away from people through climate change. And this then, in the worst case, ends up as displacement. Yeah? So that people do not have a choice but to move or face very, very severe risks, as we have heard today already. So, and I think this is how it fits into loss and damage. If choices are being taken away, this is clearly a loss of agency over one's own life. And this is also where the loss and damage fund and other mechanisms have to come in to give people back agency. Because in the end, people should have the ability to determine their own future. Yeah? And this is really compromised through the extreme weather events, through the economic losses and damages, to the non-economic losses. And these instruments can help to really then also give people the ability to, for example, have a different education, learn skills that are maybe not only tailored towards subsistence agriculture or fisheries, that can enable them to build up their resilience. Often they're well adapted to their environments because they have worked for generations in this environment, in balance with nature oftentimes. However, this environment is rapidly changing. And of course, there have been other displacements. Also, if you look at Micronesia nuclear testing, other environmental factors that have displaced people. But what we are now seeing is really this extreme shift in the Earth system induced by climate change and the transgression of other planetary boundaries. And also, we have much more people on this planet, meaning that the migration crisis may aggravate in the future, the forced migration crisis, I should say.
Thank you, Kira. And I like the emphasis on the agency part, which I think has come through kind of, across the different contributions so far. For you, Salote, what does it mean to kind of protect agency? Like, what does that look like in practice? What would it require?
Yeah. As a funder, it's really giving the power or building the power of the communities that we work with to determine what strategies need to be funded, and how that process goes, how decision making from the community level gets up to donors, funders, even policymakers, what information is required at that level that communities are willing to share. And so we work with indigenous communities. You know, there's the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which really centers their right to self-determination, and that's at the core of how we respond and ensure that their agency is respected, is protected, is funded, and supported. And we've been working with communities not only in the Pacific Islands, but also in Haiti, in the Bahamas, and in the United States, who are really supported to, one, exercise that right to self-determination with funding organizations like us, but also to create a model for how multilateral and bilateral funding should occur with frontline communities. And there's a lot of talk at COPs, even in previous COPs, about how communities should be centered, right, in decision making and policy making. That doesn't mean anything if you're not practicing that at the local level between individual organizations, individual funders, research organizations, academia, across the board with frontline communities. And we really need to support and invest in building that proof of concept before we come to these spaces and try and shift whatever is happening in these discussions. So we've been really building that in the Pacific and across the world, really focusing on participatory strategy designs as a funder, asking communities, what do you need? What needs funding? How do communities need to come to the table? What information do you need in order to make decisions at the local level that we can translate back up to the policy level? It's a cyclical process. And as organizations who are based in the global north, it's incumbent upon us as a matter of climate justice and human rights to really be practicing what we preach and not just be talking airy-fairy terms and these spaces and not practicing that. And I think as it relates to the Santiago Network on Loss and Damage, the Fund for Responding to Loss and Damage, there are proofs of concepts that exist across the world about how funding should be deployed to protect the lives of the people that we serve. This is not new, or it exists. We just need to provide that information back to the board or back to the decision makers, back to states, to show not really the strategies to address loss and damage in the context of climate mobility, but the process. The process is what is fundamental. How do we bring communities to the table in a way that really respects their agency and supports their decision making?
Thank you. I think in a way we have these, like, I have the sense, competing visions, or I don't even know if they're explicit visions, but on the one hand, it seems to me that adaptation is very much a question of money, right? The ability to be able to live under conditions that are increasingly hostile is very much determined by what can you build, how much can you cool yourself, right? And that very much often comes down to money, and then obviously also being able to put the projects on the ground. But in a way, it feels like if you had a very rich individual deciding that they wanted to extend certain islands, you could do that. And then on the other hand, I think we have this conversation around, like, well, how do we use these conversations here around climate injustice also to address some of the existing marginalization of communities? How do we address it in the governance of countries so that it's more centered around what communities really need, which to me seems is like a very different challenge and approach, right? Like the kind of technological solutions versus how do we use this to actually strengthen our systems of governance and make them more centered around the people that are most affected. And I would love to see how Ghana strikes that balance, because I'm sure as a government, you probably need both. You need investments in build solutions, right? How do you protect people through physical infrastructure? but also how do you think about creating climate action that actually works with communities that are maybe hard to reach, that are traditionally not part of the policy making process. So how are you thinking about the balance between those two, like integrating communities and also moving quick on build solutions?
Yeah, thank you very much. So that is very right. So we have some soft solutions and we have hard solutions. It's not always the case that you actually need a lot of money to be able to deal with the issue, as you rightly said. Sometimes it's just a matter of information. If you look at Ghana, up north, around November, December, January, February, March, there are heat waves. Temperature becomes very, very, very high. And if you go there and see the way they construct their homes, for example, traditionally, because of some cultural practices, they construct their homes in such a way that they provide very narrow windows. Okay, very narrow windows. And as a result of that, when temperatures are very high, they struggle to sleep in their rooms, and sometimes because of that, most of them leave up north and then come down south for survival. By just teaching them, to adapt to appropriate technology where they can modify the way they construct these homes, such that the homes will provide the needed cooling and ventilation during the times that temperatures are very high, would stop them from moving. This probably will not involve a lot of money. It's just information. It's just that they don't know that times have changed and that climate change is causing a rise in temperatures, and as such, they cannot continue to build their homes in the traditional way that they did so many years ago when the temperature was different. This kind of information doesn't require a lot of money, but it can create a lot of difference, So those are the kind of things we are looking at. How do we deal with the soft issues? Awareness creation, getting them to adapt to appropriate technology, not necessarily very high tech, and then also providing the needed early warning systems using traditional ways of providing that information. Teaching them certain observations that they need to look out for that will signal to them that this is about to happen, and that because of that, you need to either move away or you need to change some particular cultural practice. These soft things can be done and can bring about a lot of solution without necessarily pumping in a lot of money. Of course, we also need the hardware, where we need to provide infrastructure and other things to stop them from moving. For example, when it comes to the coastal area, sea level rise, you cannot address it same as I'm talking about the north, where we are talking about high temperatures. In that case, you need hardware, you need to put in sea defense. But of course, you need to also teach them how to even inculcate nature-based solutions in terms of coastal protection. And that does not cost so much, teaching them to allow the mangroves, teaching them to protect the salt marshes and not destroy them, and all of that, could help them build resilience without necessarily putting in a lot of money. So those are the low-hanging fruits we are concentrating on in Ghana, whilst we also work towards getting money to do the hardware investments that will complement some of these low-hanging fruits.
Maybe I'll go to Kira on this question of, and I don't know if you'll have an answer, but I'll ask you on the financing side. Like, I think there are hopes for the loss and damage fund. At the same time, we know that it first has to operate, but also like the financialization is not at par with what is needed. So what do you think is like a way forward on the financing side for countries? We heard the idea like social protection systems really need to step up, but that obviously also requires financing. So what do you think? Where's the way forward when it comes to financing this agenda?
Yeah, it's a complicated question, of course, because financing needs to go to all three aspects, and we joined hands on this on a policy brief together on mitigation, adaptation, migration, right? So these are the lines of defense, so to say, right? So we need to mitigate so that adaptation is effective. And if adaptation is not sufficient to keep people safely in place, then we need to enable migration solutions, yeah? And these, of course, require different funding approaches. And in the loss and damage context, of course, you need funding that are not credits, no? You need grants. And at the same time, we are seeing now a new financial instrument being developed, which is the Tropical Forest Forever Facility. And if this is successful, then I think this may be a good way forward also for other parts of natural regeneration and protection. For example, there's also the example of coral bonds. So there's new instruments also emerging where both public and private financial resources can be directed towards. And I think in the situation that many governments are facing with tight budget constraints, or also with partners like the US withdrawing funds, a significant amount of funds globally, we need to look at all aspects and all instruments while still keeping up the pressure to demand more also government-led grants.
Thank you. I was reading a piece about the Hurricane Melissa hitting Jamaica, and that this may finally trigger the CAT insurance that they had with the World Bank. But it also made me think about, well, what if you just miss the threshold? Then, so maybe you guys can speak this, but it also makes me think, like, like, as much as we need insurance, but is that a viable model really for dealing with the significant impacts that people could potentially face, right? Like if you're left with the risk that you might not meet this particular threshold that was determined in a particular instrument. So anyways, I would love to give the closing word to all speakers, like short final observations. Unfortunately, I think we ran out of time, but I would love to hear your final observations, whether it's on the financing side or any other aspect.
My final remarks will be that the first and foremost thing is that the loss and damage fund must focus on preventive than reactionary. The simple reason is that you cannot quantify some of the non-economic losses. I went to a community in Ghana where we are trying to help them build resilience for coastal protection. And this is what they told me. They said, well, you can move us, you can resettle us, but how do we move some of our cultural practices that we have here to where you want to send us? That they can't send away. So the best thing is to make sure that they are able to be resilient so that they can continue to stay where they are, so that they can only move when it becomes very or extremely necessary to do so. Their dignity is tied to where they live, and that must be the first consideration. How do you ensure that resilience is built so that they can continue to live where they are? Moving should be the last resort, and that should not be what we should look at.
Thank you. I'd encourage states to really include frontline communities as they develop their national adaptation plans, their NDCs, as states develop proposals for the funding to respond to loss and damage, practice the right to self-determination and make sure that those on the front lines are engaged and involved in the process, that funding actually trickles down to those community-based organizations who are already doing the work and who are respecting rights and also practicing, the justice elements of the work that we do.
Yeah. Migration can be a collective act of hope, and displacement can be a source of great despair. So I think our actions need to be targeted at protecting the right to stay and enhancing the freedom to go.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, and thanks to the audience. And join us on Saturday. We have a session on early warning systems, how they can be localized and linked to early action. I think it will be quite interesting for everybody who was interested in this session. So Saturday, 11:30, come back.